My name is Pete Gershon. I'm the curator of programs here at the Orange Show Center for Visionary Art. And we're really happy to have all of you here today for the second annual edition of Old Weird Houston. It's our local alternative history fair right here at the Orange Show. And it's inspired by the Orange Show Monument. If you're not familiar, this is a sculptural environment made by a self-trained builder working from 1956 to 1979 to create a monument to good health and hard work and longevity. And this monument has also been a point of inspiration for our entire organization. We lean into the idea that art is more about community than about commodity. And we like to make things here out of found objects and cast-off materials that might otherwise be thrown away. In doing so, we transform lives through creative self-expression. And we've got some great speakers here today. I'm really excited to hear from everybody. Leaping into the breach, we are missing Dr. Valentin Diakonov, the esteemed core fellow who is going to speak on the Houston hauntology that he's organized. Poor Dr. Diakonov has come down with the COVID, and he offered to come speak anyway, and I said, please don't come to Old Weird Houston with the COVID. We don't need that. So he's resting comfortably at home, and jumping in to save the day, Michael Bludworth. He's Houston's premier expert on aviation history, and he's going to be talking about the first squadron in Texas City, 1913. I got to brush up on my notes, but he's gonna give you all the accurate information. And I'm just going to pass the mic to Michael Bludworth. A round of applause would be appropriate right now.
Thank you, Pete. Good afternoon, everybody. Well, it's not afternoon yet unless you're still on standard time. I'm looking to see if the first slide has come up.
Get closer to your mic. Get close, but just hold your hand. Hold the mic closer to the mic.
Do what?
Hold the mic in your hand close.
Like this?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I usually don't use a mic, folks, unless I'm doing a stage show. That's me. Okay, there we go. All right, good afternoon again. I'm Michael Bludworth. Louder, he says, louder. And I run an educational program called Houston's Aviation History, and you can find it on Facebook. It's been around for 10 years now, and it's an in-depth look at aviation in Houston. Funny how that works, isn't it? I usually lead off with a joke, but I'm not going to do that today because I can barely hear myself. We're going to look at a program that I've been doing on the first Aero Squadron. You can see it there. This is the first Aero Squadron was the first deployment of military aircraft in the United States. And it was done in in Texas City. Let's see if the magic happens. It does. This is one of a period postcard that shows the deployment of the troops in Texas City. It was quite a large deployment. They went there in 1913. They went there to begin to train, to go to Mexico to chase Pancho Villa. What I like about this, of course, it shows you the size of it, but also the enthusiasm of the guy that made the postcard with the Longhorn, the Texas flag, which is upside down, and of course you can barely see a biplane in the distance there. It's great having these old postcards. If you don't know where Texas City is, this will give you a clue as to where it is. It's down on the way to Galveston. Here's the pennant from the first Aero Squadron. Here's another one. Texas City has a very good museum that has quite a number of these artifacts, and it's worth your while to go to Texas City, to go to the museum. I haven't been to Texas City in a long time because I'm usually on my way to the beach. and I'm going to go to the beach. And so we keep going. I've done this presentation for them in Texas City, and we've had a lot of fun. Good museum, good people. And just to fill you in, here's a vintage 1913 map showing the Gulf Coast, and I've circled in red, well, my hand doesn't appear. I've circled in red the location of Texas City. And I wanted to use this map because it shows you a couple things. Up at the top, you can see where Houston is in the red square up there. And that's as big as Houston is. And if you look down where you know 45 is, you'll notice that even Park Place and South Houston are way out of the city. It's a long way. It's not like you get in the car and drive there now. You're talking about a full day or a multiple day trip to get there. What's important on this map are the two other occasions. The location for the first airplane flight in Texas in 1910 occurred in South Houston, and I've got that in the black there. So this is the first airplane flight in Texas, and it occurred here, actually not very far from here, just on the other side of Galveston Road. And of course, we saw Texas City, and what is important is that Ellington Field will open in 1917, just 4 years later, and it's in between the two. This is indicative of the fact that the military was well aware of the wide open spaces that we had in the area. Quite a lot of attention came from the various airplane flights. This is very early for aviation. Here's a Higbee photo. Higbee was a Galveston-based commercial photographer, and he got a number of photos, which we're very thankful for. We're looking at their setup, and there are several things here that are important to see. You notice their hangar. It's canvas. It's like a carnival tent. It's a flimsy structure. And of course, it houses a flimsy airplane, which you can also see in the front. And this is where we get into the trivia that make this interesting. It's obviously a Wright Flyer, but not so obviously it's not a Wright Flyer. It is a Burgess Wright Model C Flyer. Burgess was building planes under license for Wright, and he got the contract from the government to build all these airplanes. And we're looking at one of them there, a Burgess Wright C. And that'll become, Mr. Burgess will become more important here as we go along. Here is a Burgess Wright, and if you notice, it's very unlike the one we just saw. This one is a tractor propeller airplane, and it's got a fuselage and a tail. Let's go back to that. You see, that one looks like a Wright Flyer with the stabilizers in front and the elevators out there. This looks like what we would consider a modern airplane. The Wright brothers were very litigious of their design and sued quite a number of people for stealing their ideas. But Mr. Burgess was very smart, and he bought a license. And he said, I will build airplanes under license from you, and he did. Unfortunately, Mr. Burgess took latitudes with those licenses and started modifying the airplanes, and we see it here in the Burgess C. This very airplane set a speed record flying from Texas City to San Antonio in 1913. Here's another shot of it with more commentary. Tractor biplane, which broke all previous records, and distance and duration flights. And you can see this is very different from a Wright Flyer. We don't have the two pusher propellers. We have what we would recognize as an airplane. And this is a very important step for aviation in everywhere. Here's a colorized version showing the Burgess Flyer on the ground in Texas City. I have colorized it. And here is a regular, what would be a Wright Model C, being set up for a photo. And there are all sorts of things to see here. This is the old design with the elevators in front, or the rudders in front, the elevators in the back. Here's the captain who was flying that plane to San Antonio. This is Captain Millet. Cutting his head off. That's okay. And here's another one of the Wright Seas in front of their hangars, their carnival tent hangars. This is what they mostly did, crash them, because you're learning, and that's the whole point of it, is to teach them how to fly. Also, for whatever reason, they like to take photographs of the crashed airplanes. This is actually North Island, California, but it's a good look at the Burgess C tractor biplane, and with the troops lined up in front of it. This is a panorama which you can barely see anything of, so I won't linger here, but it's a panorama of all the men on all the airplanes. Here's a detail of it. You can see the Burgess airplane down to the right with the tractor propeller on it. This is a war hydro aeroplane, and this is a Burgess with floats on it. That also was experimented with at Texas City. And here's an ad for Burgess in 1912. And if you notice, the Wrights are not mentioned anywhere, and that's because they had revoked the license from Burgess since he was modifying their airplanes, and they didn't like that. Here is a Burgess that was rebuilt by the Pioneer Flight Museum. Actually, it's a replica. I believe it went to Galveston, but I have no idea where it is now. Speaking of Galveston, this is Fort Crockett in Galveston, where they had a airfield and an Army division, or would. This is somewhat later. And this is much later, 1939, and I put it because this photo shows so much. Right in the middle there, my hand disappears, is Fort Crockett right in the middle, and down to the left you can see what is now Galveston Municipal Airport, which opened in 1932. Just a fascinating photo. I wish it was bigger. And we're back to this wonderful photo here. There is quite a setup at Texas City. The area where the deployment was, where the tents were, all this has been modified dramatically because of the Texas City dike. But the city of Texas City has a museum and an area. Here we see a couple of the airplanes that they have on display. In the back is a replica of one of the Burgess Cs, out of scale and made out of metal, but it's on a stick, so that's okay. Here's the plaque for it. And here's the layout of the camp in Texas City. It was a really big camp, and it wasn't there just for the airplanes. It was a really big deployment of soldiers to Texas City, and it would persist for well into the 20s. It was primarily set up to prepare troops to go chase Pancho Villa. The Texas City deployment opened in March of 1913 with the airplanes, and they would tear it down in October and move it to San Antonio. It was a very difficult deployment for the airplanes. Anyone want to guess why it might have been a difficult deployment? Well, you remember those canvas tents, right? And you know, if you think of Texas in the spring and the summer, we get storms. We get big storms, lots of rain, and sure enough, in the reports they sent in to Washington, they complained about the mud, the wind, the mosquitoes. And remember, malaria was still around, dengue fever was still around, black fever was still around. So this was it turned out to be a terrible deployment. Because of the conditions in Texas City being on the water. What they did like is the fact that it's wide open, it's flat, and you can just go and go. And that's one of the reasons they would come back just 4 years later and open Ellington, a little bit farther inland. But then you had the flat coastal plains again, and not quite so much on the water. So this is the impetus for the military to come back. The other thing that the deployment in Texas City did is it started the careers for a number of local citizens. One of them is Ralph Royce, who was the air boss at the Wings Over Houston air shows. He was the director of the Lone Star Museum. It was his father, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Royce, who got his initial training with the 1st Aero Detachment in Texas City. And actually, there's a comic strip about it, which you can see a little tiny picture there that shows it. And there's his son, now very involved in local aviation. But he's not the only one. This is Jimmy Waddell. Jimmy Waddell was a Texas boy, and like any good boy in 1913, you hung around at the airport, or you hung around with the troops at the aero deployment, and that made a lifelong interest in his part in airplanes. Jimmy Waddell would go on to design a number of award and record-setting airplanes. He's a record racer. Later on, he would move to New Orleans and open Louisiana's first airline, Waddell Williams Air Service. Here he is with a couple of friends, Mr. Doolittle and Williams, who was the money man for it, and Jimmy Waddell in the middle. And once again, at the time, in the late 30s, Jimmy Waddell was a well-known racing pilot, an engineer, an innovator, and he got his start in Texas City with those airplanes in 1913. But here's the ringer for the whole thing. There was another pilot, a number of them, that got their training in Texas City, and one of them is Lieutenant Eric Ellington. And I hope that name sounds familiar, because this is Eric Ellington that they named Ellington Field for 4 years later. He got his training at the 1st Detachment in Texas City. Texas City moved. They left in October and went to California, and Lieutenant Ellington went with them to California and continued training. And unfortunately, he suffered a fatal accident in California. But 4 years later, the Army would return to Houston, to the Texas area, and establish Ellington Field in his honor. See, now you know. A lot of people ask, where did Ellington come from? It's him. That's where he came from. This is just one of the small stories that make up the larger part of Houston's aviation history. To wrap up the Texas City aspect of this, the Texas City deployment was the last deployment by the military of a Wright Flyer airplane. The ones we saw before, the twin pushers. After they left Texas City, the entire deployment went to San Antonio, and by February of 1914, they had demolished all of the aircraft. And those were the last Wright-type airplanes flown by the military. At that point, they would start getting what we now know as the Curtis Jenny, the JN-4, or 2, 3, and 4. And they would use those to go chase Pancho Villa in El Paso and New Mexico. So this Texas City was the last deployment of a Wright Flyer type airplane. Just to go back, we can find one like that, or one like that. They destroyed all of them because they're dangerous. To be very simple about it, they're very dangerous, and they were destroyed. In 4 years, they would come back to the Houston area and set up Ellington Field, which became a huge training center, and of course, as you know, is still with us today. So that's just one of the side stories for Houston's aviation history. I'm only on Facebook. Well, I'm only on Facebook please come find me at Houston's Aviation History. There is more to the story. I'm also at the 1940 Air Terminal Museum every third Saturday of the month, doing a presentation on some aspect of Houston's aviation history. This is just one story in a big city, as you all know, but it's an interesting one, and the fact that Lieutenant Ellington trained is a ringer that brings it in big full circle to us today who still now enjoy Ellington Airport. And since it doesn't advance, I guess that's done. So I thank you for your time, and we'll see you again online.
All right, Marco Iniguez Alba, come on down. You're the next contestant on Old Weird Houston. Take it away.
Thank you very much. So what I'm here to do is share with you how, as the gentleman that was speaking about aviation, how technology serves the state. Well, technology can also be appropriated by social bandits like Pancho Villa and used against the state. And what I am going to present is an example of how the printing press and printing in general was used as a way to construct discourse that countered power and subverted the social order. And my presentation is on calaveras literarias and my current search for examples in the Houston area. I have had some success, but I continue searching for even better examples of Houston proper. And I have some clues, and here I'm going to present what I've discovered so far. So a calavera literaria, or a literary calavera, is a poem. And it's usually produced in a tabloid form. So this is an example of a tabloid that was produced last year at the University of Houston in Arte Público. This is an example of a tabloid that was produced in Kingsville, Texas, a few years ago. And this is a collection of poems written by university students that were poking fun at power. So I hope that my presentation can clarify what a calavera literaria is and also give you or share with you examples of what I've discovered in the archives. So first, what is a calavera literaria? Let me give you an example. This one is titled Officer Lee. Chilling with icy demeanor, Officer Charles Lee stammered, "Hands up, wetback, I mean it." Slowly, the transient turned, revealing a pearly grin to him. "I am ice," remarked the cold one, taking Charles, the bold one. So a calavera literaria is a poem that pokes fun at power. It subverts the social order. It's a randy, sardonic parody of someone's death in popular octosyllabic rhyming verses known as the Spanish copla, which is composed of 4 verses. So the Spanish copla is the standard brand, 4 verses, each one 8 syllables long. Now, like most writers, we don't always stick to form. We always expand and use our creativity to project and transmit our ideas. The first calavera literaria was penned in the 19th century in Mexico, And so I'm going to explain just a little of that history and then move on to the examples. But first, the Calavera Literaria is an example of syncretic culture. Its original form dates back to the memento mori, which was well-established forms in late medieval Europe. And here's an example of how death, or the skeleton, was used as a way to express a didactic tool to promote positive virtues by emphasizing the consequences of not living a moral life. No one could escape death. Hence, it would behoove anyone, regardless of their class status, to amend their lives in order to have a positive existence after life. As the tradition came to New Spain, what we now know as Mexico and Mesoamerica, authorian rule outlawed any type of criticism. So I mention this because the Calavera Literaria is a form of criticism that pokes fun at power in different institutions throughout a government, throughout a community. The church and the government would not allow anyone critiquing its new formations. However, one of the more important social critics of the time in the 17th century, 1600s, was Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who used her pen as a way to critique the social reality of Mexico, or New Spain at that time. So, moving forward very fast, social political change in Mexico. In 1810, we have our independence movement. In 1845, war with the United States. In 1861, the invasion from France, the establishment of the empire, Maximilian's empire. And then in 1884 to 1911, Porfirio Diaz ruled, modernizing Mexico, but simultaneously creating a chasm between rich and poor. So this creates the scenario for social critique. José Guadalupe Posada, one of the key figures that is attributed to creating the master poem, is a printmaker. He's a lithographer, and he's also an illustrator. And he joined with various people in creating what is now known as the base of the illustrative process that becomes key in the formation of popular cultural forms. In illustration, in the national mural projects, and also in film. He fuses the calavera, skulls, skeletons, with a tweak of humor. And as you can see, these two examples, one on the right is a critique of the bourgeoisie in Mexico who emulated traditions and influences from Europe, but again exhibited a chasm between the rich and poor. So as a good liberal, he responds by critiquing those lifestyles and abuses of governments and the exploitation of common people. So as I mentioned, the calavera is a form of cultural syncretism. So when the tradition, the memento mori, comes to the Americas, it fuses with the Amerindian funerary rituals. The way Sotzpantli is this rack of skulls that you see here, which was one way of exhibiting death, but it was a way to commemorate death, fallen figures, heroes, women that died during childbirth. Many people were exhibited in this form because it was something that was present Death was not something to fear. Death was something that was welcomed because it was a portal to the new existence. Again, Native Americans believed in death, but death for them was a passage. And so they entered into the underworld, and the underworld also had its own forms of moving through and eventually arriving in a different pleasant environment. So that mixes with the practices that the monks enforced on the indigenous population. So the goddess Mictecasihuatl, Lady of the Dead, no longer became important. And Mictlan, the underworld, no longer was used. So these were changed to death, la muerte, and hell. Very different, but still important to understand that this fusion is what moves the Calavera Literaria, and I'll get to how that happens. So the church moves funerary practices and the celebration of dead, the commemoration of the dead, from the summer hot months to the autumn months. And specifically, since they already had one day where the All Saints were celebrated, it chooses the second day of November as All Souls. So November 1st is All Saints, November 2nd, All Souls. And in the tradition of the United States, we also have Halloween. And so Halloween through All Souls Day or Dia de los Muertos becomes this parenthetical space-time continuum in the United States where people invert social order in a carnivalesque form. Halloween, putting on masks, putting on costumes. And at the same time, in Mexico, and as Mexicans move north, they bring the tradition of Dia de los Muertos and the celebration and commemoration of people who have passed on, believing that they visit us. So this is what's happening during this time, this subversion of the social order and our beliefs in life and death. So the Calavera Literaria, what is it exactly? It's an attempt to write and critique, but to avoid persecution and prosecution for unfavorable critiques. So the Calavera becomes a mask that is usually written in anonymous form or using some type of a pseudonym. So Lady Death is called on to take on someone that is living, someone that has a character flaw. And the way we can understand this is that the Calavera is an attempt to pen the experience that we have in the world that we live in and the surrounding forces that impact our lives. And when we think about it, the surrounding forces that impact our lives can be moved in concentric circles from the local to the global. What distinguishes the literary Calavera from the European Memento Mori is the randy and inventively humorous play between these telluric forces of life and death. The poem identifies the foible that is exposed and targets it. Let me read you another example. A Calavera Literaria is a type of testimony as well. A fake that I once saw, his name was Kavanaugh. His disrespect for the law will lead him to Saturn's maw. Compelling were the words of Ford, for too many ringing a familiar chord, causing us to hang on each word while overhead Lady Death soared. But for whom the bell tolls, only time will let us know. Some of you might remember when Kavanaugh was being contested as Supreme Court Justice, as a candidate, women began coming forward accusing him of sexual assault. And somehow that was drowned out by the support that he received. So this this calavera was written as a way to respond to that text, text in government. Okay, so the published forms of literary calaveras are usually in broadsheets, as I explained to you or at the beginning of my presentation. They are usually penned and published on for November 2nd, the Day of the Dead. Jose Guadalupe Posada illustrated skulls and skeletons, and he worked with various writers and printmakers until he became independent and established himself in Mexico City. He critiqued the shortfalls of the bourgeoisie elite, and these are examples of his famous work. Now, the calaveras are these ones that you see here in the lower middle section, and these are the poems that were then published and distributed, sometimes sold, but mainly published and distributed freely. What have I found in Texas, in Houston? So my work has focused on the calaveras in the archives that are housed in the Recovery Project of Latina heritage in the United States, specifically the literary heritage. This recovery project has compiled examples of the Hispanic literary heritage from the conquest to 1960. And as I was speaking with one of the other presenters, William, we believe that it is challenging the current makeup of how the United States understands itself as a monolinguistic culture. When you have examples of Spanish in the United States proper that predate English publications. And continue to this day. So the first calavera that I discovered, or the oldest one that is in the collection, is from in the 1940s. And this calavera publication was 16 pages, and it was in a booklet form that was an insert in the newspaper called El Mañana. And the calaveras were titled Calaveras Antiguas del Mañana. So old calaveras from yesterday, but a play on mañana, tomorrow, which is the morning also. So this is inside the Calaveras del Mañana, titled, the page is titled Huéspedes de Satán. So these are guests of Satan. And they're comical renditions that poke fun at politicos and cultural figures in the valley, in the McAllen area, which is where the publication comes from. But this publication we are now going through in the Alicia Lyons collection, and Alicia Lyons was is a very important figure here in Houston, an entrepreneur, a very important entrepreneur, and so we are now assessing through her collection, and thanks to her collection, we have examples of this amazing find of calaveras literarias. The next collection that I discovered is from the Duke of Calaveras. Now, the Duke of Calaveras, his name is Moisés Espino del Castillo. The Duke of Calaveras published in the San Antonio area, and he published his calaveras from 1970 to 2000. That's 3 decades. That's 30 years of publishing calaveras. His calaveras are penned also in a booklet form, but curiously done, he combines the calaveras with advertising. And so he wrote calaveras for people who gave a donation for the publication of his magazine. And the calaveras aren't always as biting because he has to ameliorate his writing and the critique of the figure because they are paying for his publication. But yet it's a very curious example also of how calaveras move and are established in Texas by the immigrant community. Another example in the archive, in the Recovery Project, is from the weekly periodical El Día. Now, Recovering the U.S. Hispanic Literacy Heritage also has an additional body of work that is from the periodical collections of the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, which was a massive effort to locate periodicals published along the borderlands of the United States and Mexico. So that would be small cities along the borderlands, which this comes as an example from that collection. And I just giving you a focus on this. This is Carlos Salinas de Gortari, the famous or infamous president of Mexico, who was lampooned incessantly in Mexico and throughout the United States. And here is an example of his lampooning here in the United States. Now, Carlos Salinas de Gortari is famous for also bringing neoliberalism to the foray. He was the one, along with Bill Clinton, who signed the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, in the 90s. And he, Salinas de Gortari, was the spokesperson for that. But at the same time, as the neoliberal policies, economic policies were instituted, the people on the bottom were being squeezed out, especially farmers. So he became the base of many jokes and critiques in society. And here we have one of the very famous images of Salinas de Gortari being stabbed by the fork of a demon. Okay? So other archival examples that I have found, I showed you two examples. One was from Calaca Times, which is from South Texas. It's from the Kingsville area. And the other one that I showed you was from the University of Houston, which are very recent. But in addition to that, we have also found in the Lyons, the Alicia Lyons collection, La Voz de Esperanza, which is another booklet form that is published as a newsletter. And every November, they specifically use their newsletter to publish calaveras. Now, those calaveras are very biting and hard-hitting, and they're in English and in Spanish. The Esperanza Peace and Just Center is a very progressive organization in San Antonio that focuses their work on women's rights, immigrant rights, and queer community rights. And so La Voz is key in expressing those concerns as well. Then we have the Mexican consulate here that also established a Calavera writing contest. And I was in contact with them. Unfortunately, it's not something that is recurring, but in 2022, they did host the Calavera writing contest, and this was an example of their contribution to the very popular form. So this is my example of archival examples of the calaveras. It's something that I continue looking for in the Houston area, and I'm basing my doctoral work on the calaveras literarias, which is an untouched genre form in the United States and actually in Mexico as well. So I hope to have maybe in the next couple of years more to tell upon the subject. Thank you very much.